Okay, so I want to talk about utilitarianism and abortion. And I want to talk about what utilitarianism would say both about the morality of abortion and the legality of it, right? Now, it seems, you know, if abortion is not immoral, it's hard to argue that it should be illegal. Now, it could still be immoral, but not something we should make illegal, right? So, if abortion is morally okay in a case, it is very hard to argue that it is illegal. If it's immoral, well, it still might not qualify to be legal. There are plenty of things that are immoral. Cheating on your spouse, for instance, in most cases, I would say, you know, cutting out your kids from the will out of pure spite or something. Those are immoral. Most of us don't think they should be illegal, though, right? But if it's not immoral, it is very hard to argue that it should be illegal. So let's talk about what abortion says about both the morality of abortion and whether and when it should be legal. Now, as I said before, the personhood question seems to many people to be absolutely key to this debate. If you settle this personhood question, what makes someone a moral person? Does the fetus have these features? Is it a person in the moral sense or not? For a lot of people, both on the pro choice side and the pro life side, seems like this will settle the debate. This actually seems like a point of agreement between a lot of people who take opposite sides or sides that are pretty far apart on the abortion debate, right? They agree that personhood is key. They might just disagree that the fetus is or isn't a person. But the utilitarian will surprise us here because they'll actually say they don't really care about this question, that it's not really important. Well, why not? What does the utilitarian care about? Well, pleasure and pain, right? Overall happiness being the most pleasure, the least pain. And so, for individual cases, when the utilitarian is thinking about the morality of individual cases where someone is trying to decide whether to have an abortion, the morality is settled by, will having an abortion in this case create more happiness than not? Legality of abortion, settled by the slightly different but very closely related question, will putting restrictions on abortion create more happiness than not doing so? So that's the general utilitarian framework. That's always going to be the utilitarian framework. Most pleasure, least pain, right? Pleasure black number, pain red number, pleasure plus number, pain minus number, right? Well, now it's easiest, I think, to answer the first question in cases where the fetus has some sort of genetic or other abnormality where it will die young or be severely impaired. And in a lot of these cases, it's actually unlikely that it'll even be carried to term, right? I forget the exact numbers, but Patau syndrome, Edwards syndrome, extra chromosome, a form of trisomy as they call it. Usually you have two pairs. If you have an extra one, that usually creates a lot of problems. Patau syndrome, Edwards syndrome usually aren't carried to term. They are usually die in the first year. If they manage to survive, the infant is usually, or in fact, almost, I think always, severely impaired. Tay-Sachs is a different one. Infants with Tay-Sachs seem fairly normal. Somewhere, I forget the exacts, but about a year along, they start to severely deteriorate. and then pretty quickly die. Well, so what would a utilitarian say, if somebody does genetic screening and they see that an infant has one of these diseases? What would a utilitarian say? Well, they'd pretty obviously say that it's morally permissible, right? In fact, I think the utilitarian would probably say not just that it's morally permissible, right? Morally permissible means we won't blame you if you do it. I think they would go further and say that it's morally right. This is what the person should do. Why? Well, pregnancy is not just uncomfortable, pregnancy is very risky, even in the best of cases, right? Not just that. So, if these infants are very likely to die, the woman is going through all the risk of pregnancy, all the pain of pregnancy, and there's really, heaven help me for putting this in a really callous seeming way, but I'm just doing this the way the utilitarian would say, there's really no payoff for it, right? Infants are probably not going to be carried to term in cases of Edwards and Patel syndrome. If they are, parents are just setting themselves up for heartbreak because they're going to die young in all likelihood. Not only that, right? And again, this is going to sound a little callous. Do not quote me as saying this as something I believe, but this is how the utilitarian thinks of it. The utilitarian will say, look, if you are lucky enough, in scare quotes, put lucky, that these pregnancies are carried to term, these infants are going to need all kinds of medical attention. They're going to use all kinds of medical resources. Not just that the parents are probably going to be unhappy, but they're going to use resources that could be used elsewhere. And again, this sounds callous, and I think it sounds callous because it probably is, but it's just how the utilitarian thinks. Infants with these conditions just aren't a good investment of resources in terms of paying out in happiness. Again, I feel a little icky saying that. That is not a way that I like to think about these issues, but that is what the utilitarian believes and how they would think about it. The same goes with Tay-Sachs, right? Again, usually you can deliver, they'll be carried to term, but they're just going to have these awful medical conditions and degenerate really rapidly. Misery for the parents, a lot of costs for the medical system, no payout in happiness, lots of costs and risks. Well, that gives you a pretty neat answer. I mean, not neat in the sense of like cool, but I mean neat in the sense of like cut and dried to the second question. Should it be allowed in those cases? What should the law be? Well, if doing it in those cases would create the most happiness, pretty clearly the utilitarian's going to say it should be legal, right? Not terribly complicated for them. We can go down the line, right? What about cases where the mother's life is in danger? Here, too, I think for similar reasons, utilitarianism would say that it is morally acceptable and it should be legal. Why? Well, in a lot of those cases, most of them, it's not just that the mother's life is in danger, it's that the pregnancy itself is unlikely to go to term, right? Well, if that's the case, you want to, if it's unlikely that you can save both lives, you want to save one. Well, the math is not hard for the utilitarian. And, think about it in these cases, if you pass a law, the government's going to be meddling. Laws are usually blunt instruments. Doctors are not going to be able to deal with them in the way they want. They're going to be scared of being charged or sued or whatever. You see this in news reports after Roe v. Wade being struck down, in some cases with really, where states have really restrictive laws, that's going to lead to needless deaths and needless suffering. The utilitarian will say, no, no laws, don't interfere. Now, all of that might seem fairly commonsensical. Where the utilitarian starts to look, you might not like their approach, but I don't know that any of these answers are wildly controversial, right? Where things start to seem a little more controversial are in the answers they would give for something like where long-term survival more likely and the level of impairment lower. Down syndrome being a good example of this. What would a utilitarian say in a case where an infant has Down syndrome? Well, again, I think they would say abortion is not just acceptable, but morally right. Why? Because children with Down syndrome, they can live happy, productive lives with a lot of support, but they need a lot of support. An infant without it does not need that level of support. I think a utilitarian would just say, and again, this sounds callous, quite possibly because it is callous. It's just like, well, if you're thinking in terms of payoff of happiness, they need a lot of support. They have a lot of medical conditions. They're probably going to die sooner than an infant without Down syndrome. Cost benefit, the utilitarian will say, just a bad investment of resources. Again, I think that's a more than slightly icky way to think about human life. I'm not going to pretend to be a utilitarian. I am not. That is their thought process, though. And if it's moral, and they don't think it's just morally permissible, but I think they would say it's the morally right option that people should have abortions in these cases. If it's the morally right option, I think the utilitarian would pretty clearly say it should be legal in those cases. So anyway, I'm not going to just keep going down the line. I think honestly, to cut to the chase, the utilitarian would say that abortion should be legal in practically all cases. And in practically all cases, when someone wants an abortion for whatever reason, the utilitarian will say that's going to likely create the most happiness. If someone doesn't think she's in a good position to have a child, well, what's going to create the most happiness? Her having the child now, or her having a child later, or her not having a child at all, right? If she never has a child, whatever resources put into the child she does have could go into another one, right? On top of all that, I think the utilitarian is going to say, well, anytime the government tries to restrict abortion, it's going to have unforeseen consequences. It's going to lead to interference in the care that pregnant women receive. That's going to create unhappiness. The only possible harms here are the fetus might feel pain. That's when and if the fetus can feel pain is a controversial issue. Some people say not till about 24 weeks. Other people say, it is after 15 or so, maybe even 12. Science is not always cut and dried. But at some points, it definitely can't feel it. And even if it does, probably not that great in the grand scheme of things. There might be, you might say, well, if the fetus isn't killed, it will feel all the happiness of living. But the utilitarian will say cost benefit. Person doesn't have a baby now. They will have one later, maybe when they're more prepared. If they don't have one at all, society can invest more resources with people who want to have children, right? Now, again, that might be a weird way to think about human life. It just is the way the utilitarian thinks about it. Which brings me to an issue. I think all of this highlights some unsettling parts of the theory. And probably the biggest one is one that we've talked about before, but I kind of want to come back to, which is that utilitarianism devalues the lives of the disabled, right? The utilitarian is saying not just that it's morally permissible to have an abortion when the fetus has Down syndrome, they're saying people should, that it is morally right to do that, that it would be wrong not to. They'll probably say that for a lot of other disabilities. That starts to look extremely creepy. That starts not just to look like eugenics, that is a form of eugenics, right? And utilitarians will dance around this. Peter Singer, in his earlier, less cautious phase of life, just flatly said these things out loud. These days, he'll dance around it, but it's pretty clear he still believes this. He just thinks it looks very bad for utilitarians to say it out loud, right? But if they're consistent, bad PR or not, it is what they should say. This leaves me very unsettled. I mean, look, I don't know. We'll come back to the issue of Down syndrome. I think it's a hard question for any couple. But if you start saying it's wrong to have an infant with this, and then I think the utilitarian would get into other disabilities, right? Even ones where the person might have a high level of cognitive functioning, if they use too many resources, if Singer and other utilitarians are honest about it, they're not going to like that. So I don't know. Again, I am not a utilitarian. I don't pretend to be. But I think we see, once again, to me at least, some very unsettling parts of the theory here. All right. So, nutshell thing though, utilitarians very much think there should be a right to an abortion and do not think it is morally problematic in most cases, or maybe even all cases. All right. So let's move on to the issue of personhood, which the utilitarian just overlooks. We will start talking about that in the next lecture.